And this is part of a series called In the Press, in which we variously explore the different forces, style, and subject matter of what is variously called the Fourth Estate in relation to the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners, the Fourth Power in relation to the judicial, legislative, and executive, or of course the fourth branch, that is, the press. This started off as the Media and Journalism Initiative under Deborah Jensen's directorship of the Franklin Humanities Institute, and at that time it was directed by Jonathan Katz, who is with us today. The idea behind it was to explore how Americans in the 21st century are surrounded by news media like no generations before. The sheer volume of information available on cable TV, smartphones, and social networks was overwhelming, of course, is overwhelming. And just as people are consuming more news than ever, public trust in journalists is eroding, and people are looking for new sources of information. We have total trust in who we have here today, of course. But they were looking at, we're still looking at who the people are producing all those videos and articles that we share, what's going on, what are we trying to do, how do we begin to evaluate that work. Now, in its slightly new iteration, which we're calling In the Press, in collaboration with journalist and anthropologist Brian Golson, and still in collaboration with Jonathan, who has since left Duke, the Franklin Humanities Institute is looking to bring together journalists, scholars, and activists to discuss emergent issues in the media, providing theoretical and historical context for current debates. In addition to these public conversations, future event formats will include workshops geared towards faculty and graduate students on topics such as writing for public audiences, pitching stories, working with editors, but also what kind of writing we are looking at when we're looking at journalism today. And so, of course, there will be an overlapping investigation of academic writing, investigative journalism, narrative nonfiction. So I'm just going to very briefly introduce Brian, who's then going to introduce everyone else and get us going. Brian Golson is a journalist and cultural anthropologist. He's currently writing a book, The New American Homeless, about housing insecurity and homelessness in America's boom cities, to be published by Crown, which is Penguin Random House. His long-form reporting and essays have appeared or are forthcoming in Harper's, The New Republic, The California Sunday Magazine, Guernica, Jacobin, Public Books, among other publications. He's also the co-editor of African Futures, Essays on Crisis, Emergence, and Possibility from the University of Chicago Press in 2017. At Duke, we're very proud of him, as he is a PhD in cultural anthropology from Duke. In 2017, 2018, he was a Luce ACLS Fellow in Journalism, Religion, and International Affairs. Prior to this, he was a postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows in the Humanities at Columbia University. And he is the recipient of many grants and fellowships from Fulbright, the Wenner-Gren Foundation, the ACLS. In 2015, 2016, the Justice in Education Fellow at Columbia. He taught at Sing Sing Prison. So with no more ado, Brian.
Thank you. Okay, is this, it's not on, of course. Okay. Okay, cool. And can you hear me if I don't lean in? Is this okay? Or, yeah? I know, so we're live streaming this, and okay, wanted to make sure that you can hear me and whoever is listening out there. So thank you so much, Ranji. This is a total delight and privilege to be here tonight. I can't think of an event that would more perfectly sort of fit within the ambit of what we were imagining for this In the Press project and series. And I'm Okay. And I'm so grateful to our panelists for their willingness to join us for this inaugural In the Press event. So before I introduce the panelists, I just wanted to give kind of a brief overview of what provided kind of the impetus for tonight, for this particular discussion. And so the idea for this panel took shape over the summer, and I thought it might be a good idea for a moment for us to just return to some of what was unfolding during those weeks and months, the weeks and months that we began to talk about doing something like this. So if you can place yourself, I know August and July and I need to do this, okay, no problem. I know that probably feels like a lifetime ago. It does for me, but let's just return to that. So, though notoriously blocked from public view, it was revealed in May, I believe, that the Border Patrol facilities were holding about 15,000 people, nearly 4 times their capacity. At the end of May, a Department of Homeland Security Inspector General found about 900 migrants at a Texas shelter built for 125 people. After visiting a facility in Clint, Texas, a group of lawyers decided to break their confidentiality agreements and disclosed what they saw in this facility, lice and flu outbreaks, illnesses that were going untreated, children as young as 7 or 8 years old looking after babies, holding babies they didn't even know prior to being there, extreme overcrowding, children sleeping on concrete floors in what were effectively cages. We were exposed, again, despite the best attempts by the Trump administration. We were exposed to images of infants being forcibly removed from their mother's arms, and on and on. ProPublica published an investigation into a Border Patrol Facebook group, which revealed a torrent of racism, of white supremacy, even or especially derogatory comments directed toward congressional delegates who were going to be visiting these facilities. And then finally, and this was all within like a couple of weeks span, and then finally in June, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez posted a live Instagram video in which she declared, drawing on the work of Andrea Pitzer and Jonathan Katz, among others, in which she declared that, quote, "The US is running concentration camps on our southern border, and that is exactly what they are. I want to talk to people," she said, "who are concerned enough with humanity to say that, quote, never again actually means something." And then in response to that, another representative, Liz Cheney, responded to AOC on Twitter, "Please do us all a favor and spend just a few minutes learning some actual history. 6 million Jews were exterminated in the Holocaust. You demean their memory and disgrace yourself with comments like this," end quote. And although Cheney and many of the other pundits chiming in on these issues, or on this issue, weren't Jewish themselves, their denunciation of AOC and the assertion that using the term concentration camp in this context was both a serious moral and historical error was soon echoed by a number of Jewish organizations, culminating in the US Holocaust Memorial Museum releasing a statement, quote, unequivocally rejecting any effort to create analogies, any analogy, between the Holocaust and what was taking place at the border or, again, anywhere else. A position, it's worth pointing out, that in turn, and this is all happening, within this very short span, that in turn was firmly rejected by a multitude of Jewish and non-Jewish scholars and advocacy groups from across the political spectrum. And I don't know how many of you saw this, but there was an open letter published in the New York Review of Books And even a number of faculty members at Duke, I believe, signed this letter countering the Holocaust Memorial Museum's what this letter characterized as its absurd stance. And then the whole thing went away. So this panel is premised on the idea that what came so starkly into public view in June and July was both anticipated by a whole array of earlier historical phenomena and can be found in similar guises in many other parts of the world today, to say nothing of the fact that the conditions for migrants and asylum seekers here in the US has continued to worsen despite the story's gradual disappearance from the news cycle. What's changed as far as that goes is by no means the cruelty or injustice, I suppose I should say arguably, is by no means the cruelty or injustice of what we were seeing over the summer, but simply our willingness to attend to it. So this event, if nothing else, is an attempt to refocus our attention once again on what's happening at the southern border, as well as in Lumpkin, Georgia, and Elizabeth, New Jersey, and Clint, Texas, and in so many other towns and cities, but also what's happening far beyond the US per se, along with the various prototypes and experiments going back into the 19th century that offered a kind of blueprint for how to deal with unwanted, discarded, or purportedly dangerous civilian populations. So that's my preface. That's what is kind of providing the animating impulse for tonight. And what we'll do is I'll introduce our speakers, and then each of them will have about 5 to 7, 8 minutes to offer some opening remarks, and then we will have a conversation, the four of us, at which point we'll open it up for questions. And just so you know, again, this is being live streamed and recorded for posterity. So if you are uncomfortable with that, maybe ask somebody else to ask your question, or be silent. Okay, so I'll begin with Andrea at the end. Andrea Pitzer is a journalist, and I'm taking this from their website. So
I promise it's true, though.
I haven't fact-checked it, especially this part, who loves to unearth lost history. In addition to the book that I think it's safe to say brought her here tonight, which is this absolutely essential text, One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. She is also the author, before that, of The Secret History of Vladimir Nabokov, and her next book, which I'm hoping she'll figure out a way to sort of weave into her remarks somehow, or maybe we'll save this for dinner. Her next book is called Icebound, Shipwrecked at the Edge of the World, which is about 3 Arctic voyages of the Dutch navigator William Barents, who wound up stranded on Nova Zembla during the winter of 1596. Andrea's writing has appeared in many places in print and online. She wrote an essay for the New York Review of Books called America's New Concentration Camp System, which I hope if you haven't read it already, you'll go and read right away when we're done here. So she's published in a number of venues, The Daily Beast, Vox, Slate, USA Today. She has spoken about her work at the 92nd Street Y, the Smithsonian, and as she told me earlier, the MLA convention. So her work has had a reception in the Academy, and this work really is, it has a historical rigor and depth that can easily stand alongside the best works of academic history. She grew up in West Virginia and currently lives near Washington, D.C. Jonathan Katz, next to me, is a journalist and award-winning author. That was not on his website, by the way. That was my insertion. His first book, The Big Truck That Went By, How the World Came to Save Haiti and Left Behind a Disaster, was a PEN Literary Award finalist and won the Overseas Press Club of America's Cornelius Ryan Award for the year's best book on international affairs. And that was based on a long engagement with Haiti. He was in Haiti during the earthquake, was the only foreign correspondent who was in the country at the time, and the book emerged from that pretty harrowing experience.
This is all Haiti behind us, by the way.
I did not know that.
Just throw that out.
So that was Jonathan's first book. For which he was awarded also the Medill Medal for courage in journalism in 2011. He's also been a fellow at New America in the Future of War program. That was last year. He's a regular contributor to the New York Times and other publications, and he's currently writing a book. I don't know if this is still its title, but last I checked, it was called Gangsters of Capitalism, which is an amazing title, about a man named Smedley Butler and the Marines who created America's empire. And as Ranji mentioned, he started the Media and Journalism Initiative here with Deborah Jensen, and is the path breaker that, in a way, enabled tonight's event. So thank you for that, Jonathan. Finally, Roxana Bendezú, is that his? Roxana lives here in Durham, and she serves as the executive director of Migrant Roots Media, a digital platform that collects and conveys the perspectives of migrants on the causes of their migration, as well as of those who are organizing to stay and thrive in their homes and on their lands. So I know we're eager to hear how that project is informing your perspective on these issues tonight. And again, I encourage you all to go to this website, Migrant Roots Media, and spend time, as I did, going through the contributions. She was born in Lima, Peru, and migrated to the US twice, first in 1993 and again in 1999 after political turmoil. In 2013, she collaborated with the Office of Migration and Refugees of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops to mobilize Catholic parishioners in key districts to advocate for immigrants' rights. In 2015, she accepted a position as the Associate Director for Organizing and Leadership Development at Hope Border Institute in El Paso to work on strengthening binational collaboration, particularly between faith and social justice communities. She served in a number of organizations, from Charlotte's local Sierra Club to Democracy North Carolina, and she has also supported the foundation of the Detained Migrant Solidarity Committee in El Paso, Texas. So these are our speakers, and as I mentioned, they're each going to start with some comments, and then we'll open it up. We're going to begin with Andrea, and then go to Jonathan and Roxana. So, Andrea.
All right, I'm looking here because I'm going to take all 8 minutes, but I'm going to just stop at 8 minutes, okay? I think it's really great if we start with this idea of why would we even think of using the term concentration camp for what's happening at the U.S. border? What is the basis for doing that? Because I think there's a lot of history that people don't know. So I'm going to take you on 100 years and 6 continents of history in about 4 minutes, okay? So I'm going to be skimming over some things. I think when people first hear the phrase concentration camp, the thing that springs to mind for them is Auschwitz and the death camps. I think this is totally appropriate. It's a singular moment in history. Nothing else has replicated that moment. So it's a very natural response. But what most people don't realize is that there's actually 40 years of history of things that were called concentration camps at the time before the death camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau was opened. And by not knowing that history, We are, in fact, right now replicating quite a bit of it. So I'm going to run you through some of that history, a little bit of the Holocaust itself, and then what happened after, so that we have a kind of a context in which we can have this conversation. So the very first camps of what were called concentration camps that had that name. It was a concentration of civilians, so mass detention of civilians without individual trial and outside the normal legal system for the places that they lived at that time. So this is what the detention was, rounding up large groups of civilians that were non-combatants. In the first decade, from about 1896 to 1906, this happened out on colonial periphery. It happened under a man nicknamed the Butcher in Cuba. It was a huge reason the U.S. went into the Spanish-American War. We've forgotten that part. We just remember the Maine, but in fact, the camps predated that and helped drive a lot of that. It also happened, the U.S. turned around and did it in the Philippines. The British did it in the Boer War, which are sort of often seen as the first official camps that you would recognize as looking like we see concentration camps looking. The Germans also used camps in the wake of a genocide in Southwest Africa, what is today Namibia. In each of those cases, the toll was gruesome. There were no mass executions of these civilians. There were no death squads. There were no gas chambers. There is nothing like the Holocaust that happened in those camps. And yet, in Cuba, the estimates are about 150,000 people, mostly women and children, died in these camps. It's about 10% of the pre-war population of the island. And in the Boer camps in southern Africa, the combat fatalities were outstripped and more than doubled by the civilian fatalities in the camps. Again, the huge majority of those were women and children, and they died not because anybody was shooting at them, but because the camps were poorly situated. They didn't have clean facilities. They didn't have appropriate drinking water. They didn't get nutrition. They were crowded in overcrowded conditions, and so contagious diseases spread very quickly. So these were not deliberate executions, and yet the toll of this was extraordinary. It really fell into disrepute to run these kinds of camps because they were seen as so barbaric. So how did we have them after this? World War I began, and for a number of reasons, the two main combatants at the beginning, the Germans and the British, ended up deciding to lock up the foreigners who were in their country at the time that the war began. And so what World War I did was it made the camps much less lethal. When we moved from the periphery in the colonial areas into the centers of power, into Paris, into London, into Berlin, you couldn't run those kinds of atrocious camps because there were people watching. So it got cleaned up and it became part of a PR effort, and the Red Cross got involved, and there became a bureaucracy of detention, and about between 800,000 and 1 million people were interned on 6 continents during World War I. So this is the moment where camps become very normalized. Again, what were called concentration camps at the time, but now we don't have the deaths. We have the indefinite detention. We have people with tremendous mental illness. We have the German community in England being shattered, the Anglo community in Germany being shattered. So there's a big toll, but it's not the kind of toll they saw in those colonial camps. And now the Red Cross is making sure you get your mail, you can send money. They have lending libraries in some of the camps. They become civilized. And so what people learn from that experience by the end of World War I is that if you are a pariah in your home country, for whatever reason, in this case they were labeled that because they were alien populations, if you are a pariah in that country, if you register with the police, if you turn yourself in when you're told to, you will be given a prisoner number, you will be put in detention, and at the end of the national crisis, you will be released. So this was the lesson that was learned from World War I. And in the 1920s and 30s, camps spread all around the world. Everybody was using them. The US was using them most notoriously. So this now we're in the 3rd decade of camps. The Soviet Union, as it forms in 1922, already has a legacy of some early camps from the Civil War. They begin to institutionalize them. By the end of that 3rd decade, we have the full gulag that is established. So this is now a camp system that doesn't lock up the foreigner who's in your country during wartime. You're going to lock up your own citizens. This is a real turning point. In the 4th decade of the camps, we have the Nazis come to power. And the Nazi camps, it's important to realize, because this goes to the heart of why we call things concentration camps. In the first decade, almost 9 years of those Nazi camps, they did not look like what they became in the Holocaust. And I think people have really lost sight of this because we have the torture stories from the first weeks of Dachau in 1933. Those are real. That was a very small minority of the population for the first 5 years of the Nazi camps. Most people who were rounded up and sent to them ended up released. Jews were not rounded up, German Jews were not rounded up en masse until 1938 with Kristallnacht. Individual politicians, individual people would be arrested, but they were not the mass roundups. It took even people as perverted and sick as the Nazis years to imagine camps at the heart of a genocide. So the longer these things are open, and the more room they're given to operate, and then the more secrecy in which they can operate, then the possibilities for what happens in them become so much worse. Even for the Nazis, it took them almost a decade to be able to imagine the final solution. And so I think it's important for us to realize there was a whole concentration camp tradition that came before that, and that those initial Nazi camps did not look that different than camp systems that were operating in some other parts of the world in the early 1930s. But after the Holocaust even, the camps did not go away. Auschwitz reset the bar and became what a concentration camp was, but we lost the name for all those other things that had been concentration camps. And there was never another Auschwitz, and we should hope there never will be. But there were many, many other things, and there continue to be today many, many other things that are part of that concentration camp tradition from those first 40 years. Every other form of camp has continued to exist and exists now, but we have no name for it. So we do not recognize these relationships. We don't understand how they fit in. After World War II, it split into a binary, and you had the Soviet-influenced huge communist camp systems, which in terms of the toll on generations and numbers of people, probably the largest, because just China alone being modeled on it is huge. You also have Vietnam, you have a number of other ones, and in the West, you had colonial camps. You had the British in Kenya, you had French in Algeria, you had the US in Vietnam. Again, I'm skimming very quickly here. South America, we have Chile and Argentina under military dictatorships, and other Central and South American countries. That provided the basis of a lot of what happened in the US with the War on Terror. And what we have at the border today rises out of some of these traditions. How does it rise out of it? We have mostly women and children. We have not mass executions, but poor conditions, lack of care, abusive guards. Again, not executions, not genocide in an organized gas chamber style, but we have a tremendous legacy of institutionalized brutality and neglect, which we've seen before has terrible, terrible tolls. And then it also combines with some US traditions, because each of these camp systems develops in light of the place that it takes root. And what are the populations that get targeted in the US? Historically, before there were even such things as called concentration camps, we had slavery, we have Native American reservations, we have, after that, we have Chinese Exclusion Act, we have Japanese American internment. In each of these cases, we have some family separations. We have populations to whom we deny the rights of citizenship, which we then feel free to have detained. That's a common theme in US history. And when we isolate a group and target them that way, then there's a kind of a license that develops in how we treat them. So this is a theme of how it plays out, but it's important to say we need to look at the particulars of what's happening on the border. At the same time, it is, as Brian noted, happening around the world. There are border conflicts and border detention camps with the Rohingya in Myanmar, in Zhejiang province in China with the Uyghur detentions with 1 million to 3 million people in detention. We've just been seeing it in eastern India, also border region. So there's a border phenomenon that's happening. So it's a local thing that's based in US history, but it's also part of a global movement that's happening right now. So thank you.
Jonathan.
All right. Hello. So thank you for that. That was really awesome. I'm tempted to yield the balance of my time to you, but I will. We can divvy that out later. I want to make one programming note just as a disclaimer. I actually personally had a stroke a month ago, basically a day short of a month ago. So this is basically one of my first times like out of the house, but this is very much my first time like making a public anything. So I just want to let you know that if my arguments are bad, if my analogies are ill-construed, you can blame my neurologist in Charlottesville. So I want to tell you, I came to this topic because of my new book, Gangsters of Capitalism. I'm writing about the formation of American empire in the early 20th century through the life of a Marine named Smedley Butler, who I'm happy to talk to you about later if you haven't, anyway, whatever. But in doing that book, I'm traveling around the world and trying to understand what what the foundations of American empire are in the places that we invaded, basically starting in Smedley's first war, which was the war in 1898 in Cuba against Spain, and then he died on the eve of World War II. So because of that, I became aware of this role of concentration camps in America's push to global imperial war in 1898, as you exactly put your foot on, finger on. That's aphasia. The atrocities that Butcher Weiler and the Spanish colonial government were visiting on the Cuban people were actually what really propelled America to that war. And actually, what I'll say is that in the course of that war, which then morphs into a new war as the United States takes control of these former Spanish colonial possessions, including the Philippines, and starts annexing them in the name of the United States, we then, ironically enough, in this war that we started to free a benighted people who had been kept in concentration camps, start using concentration camps ourselves in order to specifically control the Filipino people. And in the same way that the debate over nomenclature is happening now, it was happening then as well. I mean, this is just a couple of years after the newspapers in the United States are full of this new term, concentration camp, and it becomes very clear that that's what we're doing in the Philippines. We're imprisoning people without trial, cutting them out away from the population and leaving people to get sick and to die. And I wanted to understand what this term was, concentration camp. I wanted to understand how it fit into the connotations that we put on that word now. And I was having trouble finding sources on this. Fortunately, in September 2017, a book came out called One Long Night, which was amazing, like this incredible book that was like, it was as if like it was like the future of my research, like coming back in time to like tell me what I was supposed to figure out. And it really put into context what the United States was doing with the rest of the world. At the same time that is happening, in late 2017, in 2018, I turned on the news, or honestly, Twitter, and I realized that the same things that I'm reading about in Andrea's book, in other sources that I'm working on, are happening in real time in my country now. And I felt like I had a responsibility as a journalist, who is not a historian, is married to a historian, but is not one, to try to put as much precision on this word as possible, and create the connections that the public should know between what was happening in our country now and what this historical legacy had been. And there's a terrific quote from Hannah Arendt who is also quoted in Andrea's book, that where she, who knew from concentration camps, gives the definitions that what is happening to the people who are being, what defines a concentration camp that is different from other kinds of mass incarceration is that it is as if what happened to them, to the people who were inside, were no longer of interest to anybody, as if they were already dead. All right? So I wanted to speak out as a journalist. I wanted to speak out as a researcher. I wanted to speak out, frankly, as a Jew and somebody who had lost a significant portion of my family in the Holocaust. And I have a new newsletter called The Long Version at katz.substack.com. And one of the very first issues that I put out, I called "Concentrate on the Camps." I wanted to draw attention to what was happening. And one of the things that I couldn't figure out was how these atrocities were happening in real time in our country, and yet nobody seemed to be paying attention. Right? There were dribs and drabs of information. There were Inspector General reports. But it was not part of the major narrative that we thought of when we thought of ourselves, when we thought of this president. And I thought that needed to change. And I honestly thought that one of the things that could change that was using this term, concentration camp. I gave a talk about this at Johns Hopkins a couple weeks before my stroke. And Nathan Connolly, who is a terrific historian there, made a analogy. And Nathan is black, and I'm not going to use the word that he used, but it is a racial epithet that he talked about the way that word kind of just pulls out something in your soul. That makes you think, it basically collapses time. And it makes you think about all of the things that happened before what is happening now, and to understand where things can go. And I think that I realized that it was important to have that term. And I put out that call, Andrea put out that call. Some people listen to us. A lot of people listen to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And when she put out her Instagram video where she used the term, it really turned this conversation on its ear. And I want to say to anybody who would like to ask, why is it important to use this term? Aren't there other terms that we can use? John Podhoretz, there are other people, other interlocutors of mine and others in the world who made this same argument. The first time that we were sort of broaching this topic of concentration camps in America under Trump in 2018. And I think it is very clear that what happened from the moment that AOC used this term and introduced it into the public context puts the lie to that idea of euphemism. Concentration camp is itself a euphemism. Under the Nazis, it was a double euphemism. But by calling things what they are, and by using that term that collapses time, it has changed the conversation. And even though it is not, we don't have the same focus on it that we did when this debate was especially hot in the summer, even though nothing has changed, even though that debate did not really come from a particular crisis moment in the formation of the camps, or now, it's in our minds now, and that toothpaste can't be put back in the tube. And I think it's important to continue having conversations like this in which we focus on this history. And the last thing that I want to say is, I think maybe this will lead into some of Roxana's comments. The people who are there is a way of framing the conversation about concentration camps in the United States in the year 2019 as part of a debate about immigration, right? What do we do with immigrants? Like a lot of times people will say, like online or whatever, like, well, what would you do with these immigrants? What is your solution? To which my answer is, do not put them in concentration camps. While I believe that there is an important conversation to be had about immigration in the United States, and it is very important to understand the experiences of the people who are in America's concentration camps now. As Andrea was saying before, it's important to understand that these are part of a much larger history. This is, first of all, this is not the fault of anybody who is being detained in America right now, any more than it was the fault of my Jewish family members for being detained by the Nazis and in the greater German Reich. Because the concentration camps are a way of otherizing people and creating aliens of our neighbors and our friends in our midst, it is not something, and is very much part of this president's, again, while he is building on things that came before him, including things that, yes, President Obama did, he is using camps as part of an explicit fascist white nationalist project whose endpoint is not in sight. And so while I believe it is extremely important to talk about the people who are in the camps now and what is happening to them, it is also important to remember that concentration camps never end with the first group of people who are put inside of them. And once this power is put in the hands of the state, it is very hard to take away, in part because they can be used as tools to stifle dissent and to stop people who are trying to resist these forces from doing so. So anyway, that's what I was thinking.
Okay, and Roxana.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Can people hear me okay in the back? Okay. So I have a few notes that I need to read just to make sure that I talk about different points that I need to make. I want to first ground us in truth and take a moment to acknowledge whose land we're standing on right here, right now. The land of the Innu and Occaneechi peoples. The Occaneechi Trail, a popular trading path, ran right through Durham. These were people who cultivated and loved this region, the river, their animals, their clean environment for centuries. But where are they now? And where are the majority of the people who inhabited this side of the world, amongst them my ancestors? Well, the great majority were massacred, and their land was stolen. The indirect descendants of those victors of such atrocities participated in the eventual creation of a nation founded on genocide, slavery, lynching, and pillage. And it didn't start with Trump, although with him, the mask is off. It started more than 500 years ago when our continent was first invaded. Systems and gods were imposed on us without any consideration of our cosmovision, nor our own wisdom. Our temples were destroyed and our leaders were murdered. But we're here, we're survivors. And here we are today, talking about concentration camps. It makes a lot of sense if you think about history, if you think about the current economic model that runs the world, if you think about even the aspirations of regular people. There are reasons why Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. There are reasons why Bolsonaro was elected president of Brazil. And there are reasons why many other fascists have gotten elected leaders of regions across the world. These reasons are white supremacy and capitalism. We know that the US, wrongfully called a democracy, has not stopped their atrocities at the border of this stolen land, but has expanded across the world, though they have added to their weaponry. In addition to military troops, They now also have free trade agreements like NAFTA and CAFTA, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, investor-state dispute settlement, we should all know what that is, USAID, and Bayer, Coca-Cola, Walmart, ExxonMobil, Amazon, JP Morgan Chase, Duke Energy, Bank of America, and many, many others. With all of these new weapons, they have managed to create conditions that hundreds of thousands of people are escaping from. That is what is happening south of the border, nothing else but displacement. These are the reasons why, in January of this year, I launched Migrant Roots Media, a digital platform that seeks to uplift voices like mine, voices of migrants to speak up about the root causes of our own migration. After working in a few organizations that supported immigrants' rights, some regional and other national, I realized that there was no room for analysis. All they wanted from us was to hear our sad stories as victims. There was no space to confront the actions of the US government in our territories of origin. This was not accidental. When it is mentioned in the mainstream media how for decades a school, when is it mentioned in the mainstream media how for decades the School of the Americas has trained military personnel from Latin America? When is it mentioned that the US government continues supplying money, for example, to the Honduran government right now? Regardless of the fact there is the Berta Cáceres Act that could be passed and that could be stopped right now. I want to also talk about the concentration camps and how they came about. And I want to mention a paragraph, and it would be great if somebody can tell me who wrote it. I know that people will not enjoy hearing all this, but there is nothing more empty-headed and insane than our present naturalization law. Currently, there's one state that is making at least a feeble effort to create a better system. Of course, it is not our model German Republic where this good sense has taken hold, but the United States of America. By excluding all immigrants who are unhealthy and outright refusing entry to certain races, the Americans are showing at least faint signs of a common attitude in the race-based nationalist state idea. Hitler, Mein Kampf. So the US is an inspiration. At the same time, I want to mention a paragraph that some of you may recognize. And it reads, I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the strike toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. I'm okay. Yes, and I will conclude with that, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you.
We have a microphone. If people who have a question can offer the microphone.
Yeah, we were gonna just,
Okay, never mind.
but hold on to your question. Thank you for the richness
and depth of those remarks. I have a question that I think can be addressed by all three of you. So Andrea, in your book, you talk about the actual technologies and infrastructure that were needed to allow these concentration camps, going back to the very beginning, to flourish and to function. And among those technologies were barbed wire and machine guns. And you talk about how prior to barbed wire, it was logistically impossible to contain a multitude of people without a standing army, and that this simple technology allowed that to happen. I want to ask another question about technology and infrastructure, but it has more to do with, I think, what could be called like the psychic infrastructure that's needed to allow concentration camps to flourish. And so I'm wondering if all three of you can speak to what has to happen on the level of the citizenry, of the public, of the guards who will be watching over these detainees or inmates or prisoners. What has to first happen on that level in order for these camps to function? And maybe we could start with you, Andrea, and you could maybe speak to some of the history. Historically, what has had to happen?
I'm really glad you said that, because when I was writing this book, my brother said to me, how depressing is it to know this is just like human nature, that this is just going to happen again and again and again? And I said, no, that's not it. It isn't human nature. That's not what's going on here. It was really helpful to me to frame it so that I could think about it in a coherent way. People have to be trained to do this. This doesn't emerge from individual human nature. This emerges from a government or party that decides to manipulate its position and its ability to create fear and unrest and unease and anger. And they have to manipulate those levers for a very long time. It isn't something that can happen overnight. It takes a long time to develop, and you have to train people to it. So you're talking about the citizenry. The citizenry has to be trained to see a particular group. And it's the same language. Literally, when Trump came down the escalator and started with rapists and started, and then very quickly we had the drug stuff. I mean, we had all the rhetoric that 2 weeks later, I was in Myanmar sneaking into Rohingya camps, and I also interviewed people who wanted their former neighbors to be in camps. And it's a rare chance to get to interview a population that is advocating for that real time. And so it was terribly difficult, but I talked to them. They used exactly the same language that Trump had. I mean, the exact same words about their Rohingya Muslim neighbors that he was using on the campaign trail. So much that I even said, do you know who Donald Trump is? Because at that point, he was the Republican candidate. He wasn't at all thought that he was going to even win the primary for the Republicans. And so they said no. They had no idea who he was. But by the day after the election, in one of the poorest states, in one of the poorest countries in the world, there was a printed banner hanging in that city congratulating Donald Trump on his win. So in that interim between when I was there and when the election happened, they learned who he was, and they realized he was one of theirs. He was the kind of guy who wanted the same things that they wanted. And so what I learned in doing this research was you have to train citizens to accept it. You have to train people to impose it, so that means training guards. I think the kind of hardening we've seen with Customs and Border agents, the kind of hardening we've seen with ICE, and it's easy to say that and just throw it around, but literally, arresting people outside hospital rooms, arresting people outside courtrooms, taking parents as they're dropping children off, who are U.S. citizens, many of the children are U.S. citizens, on their way to school. Training people to do that creates a guard force. And I don't know if you saw, there was an article out just today, I think, or yesterday, that the abuse rate by Customs and Border agents is much higher than any other force right now. We are literally creating a situation in which they are being trained to do worse and worse things. These are the mechanisms of things that you have to do to be able to have a system like we have. And once you train people to do that, you lose control of it. It is easy to start. It is very hard to reverse and shut down.
And it's important to, first of all, remember the ways that the existence of these bureaucracies before Trump even came to power helped pave the way for him to come to power. I mean, that's, it is important to understand abuses that went on under Barack Obama and George W. Bush, right? And it is important to understand their complicity and their role in fomenting those abuses. But those bureaucracies were incipient fascism, and they helped. The ICE workers came out for Donald Trump, right? When it was the ICE union, right? When he was a candidate. So I left out of my opening spiel that I actually. Basically because AOC had been reading my newsletter, I went down to El Paso with AOC and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus in, I guess, end of June or beginning of July. And I visited a couple of places with them. Now, I wasn't allowed inside. No one was allowed inside except the members of Congress, and they weren't even allowed to bring in their cell phones. One maybe anticipating in a better way his Republican colleagues who brought their cell phones into the skiff. In the Capitol, Joaquin Castro recorded a very short video of some Cuban women who were being held in one of the hieleras, one of the ice boxes. But other than that, they weren't able to bring any recording devices inside. But I was able to get a sense of, first of all, the people who were working in these places. I was actually briefly detained myself. I don't think it had anything to do with my journalism. But trying to come back into the U.S. from Juarez. And so I got an unintentional deep tour of a border station. And I even ran into at Clint, which was one of the places that you talked about because it had been in the news, protesters who were there protesting both against the concentration camp and real living American pro-concentration camp protesters. And one of the things that really stuck out to me, especially coming from recently in North Carolina, now in Virginia, going down to the border, was that the people who were out there protesting for concentration camps, waving a Trump flag, and staffing the Customs and Border Patrol stations were, for the most part, not white. They were, for the most part, Latino, who were actually staffing in the border stations, and there were sort of a mix of people, but most of them not white, who were the Trump supporters, and it's interesting, right? Because first of all, racism can exist anywhere. White supremacy can exist in anyone, but at the same time, there are all these different individual stories that are being woven into this larger tapestry of fascism. Whether it's sort of the great American tradition of new immigrants coming and getting their papers stamped and then turning to the people in line behind them and saying "foreigners out," or people who people who see themselves as part of a ruling class or a potential ruling class, who are trying to differentiate themselves with people that they think are less than themselves. But these are people who shouldn't need, especially the Mexican population in El Paso, a historically binational city, who shouldn't need help seeing their neighbors as people who are equal to themselves and not deserving of being put behind barbed wire, and yet And yet they do, because they have a paycheck to cash, because they think that they're the good one who is there doing the important work, that the bad ones who are also at ICE or at CPB, it's like, well, I'm the one who's nice to the inmates, and so I have to be there to help them in that way, or people who are just assholes, and assholes can come in any shape or color. But it was really fascinating to look at the way that this. The way that debate was happening on the ground, and the ways in which people are creating new narratives in our own times to perpetuate these kind of atrocities.
It really shows how successful Manifest Destiny was here, right? Thinking about how they taught us that we were less, that we were ugly, that our darker skin was not valuable, that we needed to strive to be like the Europeans. And unfortunately, there is a lot of internalized racial oppression amongst Latin American people. And that's something that we need to work on in our own communities, of communities of color. And this is throughout the world. Of course, as you know, there were schools where they would take indigenous people to teach them how to act white and forget about our own ancestral wisdom, our own ways of doing things, our cosmovision, and try to make us strive to be like them because they were civilized, right? You can clearly see how civilized they are now that, because of the state of our planet, right? No. So it's really terrible. And of course, our ways, the sustainable ways, were much better. And so what are we striving for? That's a narrative that really needs to change. But unfortunately, we have places like the School of the Americas that are teaching, in this case, army officers, how to repress the people. And we're seeing these scenes now coming from Chile of how the military personnel are shooting people left and right and detaining people left and right just because they are tired of the neoliberal system that was imposed onto them, through the Pinochet regime by the Chicago Boys. And I hope you also become familiar with that.
If I could jump in to say that the School of the Americas and this training that was done is in my book and is an important part that we should learn about, but I think it's taking on an additional new face today, which is we have the Remain in Mexico policy, and we have these agreements to sort of have safe third countries, which are not at all safe or stable, or I think in the case of Guatemala, maybe took in 8 asylum seekers or refugees last year, and then we are trying to shove it into a bureaucracy that doesn't exist, to basically outsource and preempt people from getting to the border. And I wrote a piece for the Washington Post over the summer that suggests that with these policies, we're basically trying to stop people from even getting to the border. And I think rather than resolving the issue in any way, it's not going to change the fundamental kind of detention we're doing for the people that get here. It's backing up people into Mexico. I have a lot of friends reporting on the border that are talking about the increases in rapes and kidnappings, and in some cases murder, extortion, robbery, for people who literally in some cases are sleeping out in the open or crowded into shelters. And what I suggested in that piece I wrote for the Post is that we are essentially putting Mexico and then potentially further countries going south as we go geographically down into the position of having to make decisions about opening their own detention camp systems. We will effectively outsource a concentration camp system to countries that have even less ability to undo it than we do. Because I do think it's important to say that we have all these tones of fascism, we have this rhetoric of fascism, we have some of the institutions of fascism that have been building over time. But right now, almost everybody in this audience, if you're Native American and trying to protect a pipeline, you're in trouble. If you're Black Lives Matter protester, you're in trouble. Most Americans could go out in the street tomorrow and not suffer a lot of consequences. There's a huge number of people. You could run for office. You can say stuff against the government. You could go out on the street. So I think it's important that we don't fall into a sense of powerlessness. Many of these camp systems that have existed around the world People literally risked their lives to say anything or do anything against the government. The majority of the U.S. population could show up tomorrow and stop anything they wanted to. We've seen this in Korea. We've seen the power in South Korea. People removing, elected officials that are not fulfilling their agreements, anti-corruption moves. But the U.S., we have a lot of options, and we aren't taking them. And I think instead we're outsourcing these detention camps south of the border.
So despite my several pages of questions that are incredibly detailed and intricate, I'm noticing the time, and I imagine there are many questions from you all. So I'll hold off on some of my questions, and we can turn it over to you guys in the audience. And there is someone with a microphone.
First of all, thank you. Everybody was wonderful. So I'm really grateful for your what you all said. So my question is twofold. The first part, in my generation, we went to the streets to march against the Vietnam War, and I think we made a difference. Why isn't this generation of millennials doing the same thing to change the tide? And if that won't work, what are you all suggesting we do to make a difference? Because I'm kind of horrified how small the crowd is. How I expected it to be overflowing with people being interested, and so there seems to be such an apathy. So the question is, either how do we get a spark, or what is it specifically that each of you suggest we do? Because otherwise it's going to continue to be status quo here and around the world, or get worse.
Yes, I think it's quite the opposite in many ways. There are many groups organizing, many young people. I mean, we saw the mobilization by Greta not long ago, and that was incredibly successful. I think there should have been maybe more effort to uplift voices of indigenous people, and maybe for them to be the face of this type of campaigns. But what they achieved was pretty huge. I think we have to just be careful about not greenwashing and whatnot. There's a lot of that. But pushing for the right policies, I think this is something that is being done. And in the U.S., I believe there are certain groups that are also organizing around the climate change in particular. Yes, perhaps we need more effort to support groups that are working on migration. I think we still don't have enough effort, and it may have to do with the fact that past generations are still here, are not as supportive, are not really putting their resources and giving up their wealth that has been accumulated by stolen profit to make them work and to create spaces and to create this time that people need in order to become more active. A lot of the young people are struggling with paying school debt, and that's real. That was not the case back in the day. It's a huge difference that is really keeping the young population kind of stuck. But regardless of that, I'm seeing a lot of efforts to do something and to mobilize. It may look different now because of social media and whatnot, but we definitely need to turn it more from like online to offline and whatnot. But I think the younger generation really gets it and gets more than the older generation got, which is great. It's like hopefully that evolution, right, that we all go through. And I hope that what we are talking here right now, it would be laughable in the future because our children would be way more advanced in their narratives and way more advanced in their actions. And so I really trust the youth.
Just real quick on that, Roxana. I would love for you to just speak very briefly. Before the event, you and I were talking, and you mentioned a distinction in the response by ordinary Americans, who people watching these atrocities unfold, and you made distinction between what you called condescending charity and justice. And I wonder if you could just really quickly speak to what you mean by that and how you've seen.
Yes, I think that realization is really informed in the letter from Dr. King of how there are people who claim to be supportive of our issues, but at the last hour, when it's a moment to act, they are not quite with you. They want to stop you from taking a more radical action or from speaking about things that may touch them because they have a 401k. And if you actually do all the things that need to be done to stop this, we need to really revise those accounts because that money is being injected to this concentration camps, to a lot of the injustices in the world in general, really. And so how much solidarity are we getting from that generation, from those people? Instead of saying, oh, I support you, you poor thing, I want to hear, oh, actually, we are equal and we need to look for justice. And I have to start with my own life and my own ways of doing things. Mm-hmm. And so how do we take steps to do that? And that would make a huge difference.
In terms of the what can people do, I'll just chime in with the historical thing. How have camps ended? Like, what have people done to help end them? You know, what's been useful? In general, I would say, keeping in mind that free and fair elections usually stop pretty quickly after you have a large concentration camp system. So we're in a slightly different universe than that right now.
I'm not sure that's true. But
no, I'm slightly. I said slightly, okay? You know, we still have a little room to maneuver here. In general, elected legislators do not stop the camps. They are either too complicit or they're too weak. In the case of the U.S. House of Representatives right now, I'd say they're too weak, which doesn't mean there's nothing they can do, but they can't single-handedly do it. In the case of the Senate, we have the too complicit version, right? They're they may not be committed to the camps. Some of them seem to be, but other ones may not be. But they're willing to go along because it keeps them in power and it gets them what they want, because this isn't an important enough priority for them to lose anything over it. And again, there's a group who's perfectly happy with things going the way that they're going. And you can play those off of each other. Historically, what's made the difference is as much, and this is a little grim, but as much as you can keep an independent judiciary, which I think we still have in the U.S., but the judges that are being named at a breakneck speed are going to be corrupting the system for decades to come. So we right now have a Supreme Court is a kind of its own strange place, which we won't get into because we need to get onto this. But there are a lot of judges in the system that are actually standing up for the law. I mean, some pretty amazing rulings, and making them in some ways it's going to be hard for the Supreme Court to undo when it gets to appeals. And so they will undo some of that, but they won't undo some other parts. And I think that there's still some hope in that. So organizations that are buttressing the independent judiciary, that are bringing cases and bringing them smartly. I was heartened to see all the money pouring into the ACLU after some of these things happen. There are other groups that need to be working on this and focusing in different ways. The ACLU has been changing a little bit what their agenda is, which is also concerning. So I think find groups that are supporting the judicial initiatives that you prioritize and support those groups. If you're an attorney, work with those groups. Support attorneys that are working with the groups that you support their initiatives. Run for office yourself. Literally, local offices and local action and building stuff in your community is a really important part of figuring out and determining what your community will and won't go along with. There are places in Nazi Germany that resisted Nazi edicts and rules, that were able to preserve small parts of independence through local community action, through organization. There are a tremendous number of things that you can do in your own neighborhood, in your own world, but independent judiciary and voting while you can still vote are two, and I mean, it sounds simple, but like we really have a lot of options here, people. Like, you know, we really, really do. It's important not to just feel like, well, we'll vote and we'll see what happens. You know, like that's a really defeatist attitude because there's a lot of propaganda out there, you know, and it moves people. And if you can make people afraid and then you can turn that fear into anger, you can manipulate populations into being willing to do almost anything. I think that anti-Semitism that existed in Europe and around the world, but particularly in Europe, for centuries before the Nazis came to power, was a singular moment and gave them levers to move that would be hard to replicate anywhere else in the world. But I do not feel that the people who lived in 1930s Germany or the people who lived in Chile in the 1970s, they are not fundamentally different. Evolution doesn't happen in a couple of generations. We're the same kind of people. And Americans, with the history that we've been talking about here, are no less willing to commit bloodshed and do terrible things than any other people in history. Our institutions, which are flawed and problematic, but are stronger than most places that have ever had camps, are the thing that we have to buttress, and we have to build in a way that, you've heard the thing of like binding some people, and have you guys know this phrase? I'm going to get it wrong. Can anybody say it? Like that the binding of some people, the law binding. Oh gosh, there's the idea of justice that frees certain people but only binds the other people, as opposed to binding everyone and then guaranteeing a kind of liberty to everybody. And right now we do have a system that binds a lot of people for the benefit of a small group of people. But we still have a law that can be maneuvered and expanded, and in a lot of places that had camps did not have that. So strengthen our institutions to actually protect everybody is really crucial. That's along with, I think, making public protests. If you look back against Pinochet in the 70s, it wasn't, it didn't stop the camps. The camps had largely stopped before then, but it did, the plebiscite actually helped reduce and reverse what had happened in Chile. So direct action in the streets can really make a difference.
Hi, my name is Diana, and I kind of want to speak to your question. I'm also very disappointed that a lot of people aren't here, but I think it's important to realize that this is a PWI, and the way that immigration is framed is very, very racialized, and so it's a problem it's considered a problem only for individuals who are non-white. And I mean, Duke is very reflective of the U.S. It is predominantly white. And the way that it's been racialized, that immigration has been racialized, especially within our southern border, this seems there have been people protesting Black Lives Matter, Viva la Raza, the Chicano movement, all of that. You won't know about it unless you seek that information. And I mean, in classes and stuff like that, the only reason that I knew about this lecture today, sorry, I'm pretty heated right now, is because there's a class who mentioned it. And I think that it's very important that within the Vietnam War, it wasn't exclusive, or it wasn't viewed as exclusively about non-white individuals. Mm-hmm. It was everybody, as in Americans, and that included white, and so that's why people cared. And people have been protesting, speaking up, but nobody's listening because, again, it doesn't directly affect, or for the majority affect white individuals. And so I think I want to open up the discussion for us to talk about kind of the racialization of immigration, and how with Trump's calling Mexicans as if they constitute all of Latin America, rapists and murderers and criminals, that's caused this kind of framing of, it's very much the way that slavery and the Jim Crow laws were in the South and remain in the South, this whole view of discrimination against non-white bodies and how they're viewed as this evil that we need to get rid of.
Thank you for that. Yes, that was great.
Yeah, kind of a comment too to echo off that. I mean, if you look at the Women's March in DC and how many women showed up versus DACA, Dreamers, and all of that, I really want to call in folks who do mobilize. And you look at the Women's March versus the explicit march against Trump's presidency on J20, and the difference in those two events. And so really want to call folks in to stand in solidarity with folks who really, there have been mass actions, mainly in major metropolitan cities, but to keep our eye on that. But one thing that I was thinking of and that I've been challenging, I work for the ACLU, to think about really is the intersection of the carceral state, the prison industrial complex, and the way detention is being used. A lot of our members are crying about what's happening out on the border and not understanding that interior enforcement in North Carolina looks like sheriffs holding people. It looks like Alamance County signing a $2.8 million IGSA, Intergovernmental Service Agreement, with the US government, with ICE explicitly, to hold 50 people in detention and to bus them to Stewart. And this is someone who's considered too racist by the own US government, DOJ, and couldn't continue his 287G program, which is like the gold star for detaining people and having ICE agents in jails. And so I think what gets lost sometimes too is when we look at like the monolithic, immigrant population is only Latinx, and the way that when we're, a lot of these places, they're contracting with jails to extend detention, not just for immigrants, but just more policing in Black and brown communities. So I wondered if any of you all had comments on that intersection, because what's happening too is places that are closing down jails because organizers are organizing against the new Jim Crow and closing down jails, they're opening up, like in Louisiana, private facilities because they want that influx. And for places that are closing down private detention for Black folks, predominantly Black people being held in detention, now they're opening it up with immigrant detention. And so I've been challenged to push our ACLU members to think of it as like one carceral state in a much broader agenda, but I wondered if you all had thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, you're nailing it. It's Americans are, I mean, this goes for a lot of people in the world, but Americans are inured by we live in the country. We live in a country that I always forget the exact statistic, but I believe we incarcerate a larger percentage of our population than any other country in the world. I believe in terms of absolute numbers, it is definitely the largest prison population in the world. I mean, look, people are used to people being put in prison. They're used to people who, I mean, it's just a normal part of American life, which is ridiculous. And because the ways that it intersects with white supremacy, it is primarily non-white people, people who who essentially white people or wealthy people or both see as posing a threat to them, who they want to disappear. Another thing that I've been dealing with in my book, I mean, there's just like my whole book, which I've spent the last month not working on, is like sort of like it's just like all coming back to me like in pieces here, in part because of the history of American imperialism in Latin America, but also the very first place that Smedley Butler goes to in 1898 is his first post as a Marine is at Guantanamo Bay. And I went to Guantanamo in 2017, actually right as your book was coming out. And the way that Guantanamo in the post 9/11 world, which builds on the Guantanamo that was actually, the detention center was built in the 90s to house Haitians and then Cubans. But in the post 9/11 world, it was in the American imagination, it sort of exists as a black hole, right? It was a place that we could just like throw our enemies and they would just go away. And you see in sort of normal joking political discourse the way that Guantanamo is used. It's a place to put your enemies. It's a place to put Hillary Clinton. It's a place to put anybody who you don't want to be around. And so we somehow need to disrupt that. I think that one of the major things that we can do is by putting the human face on the people who are being detained. That is true for people who are being passed in and out of the prison system. Sort of on a normal basis, right? And people who are in in these camps. In the piece that I wrote for my newsletter, I use the term concentration camp And I thought that was a really important way to focus the conversation. But I was also calling on my colleagues in the media to, what I was sort of imagining at the beginning of the piece was that CNN would have a camera crew out in front of the Dilley Family Residential Center, talking about euphemistic language for concentration camps. And have at the bottom of the screen, instead of a countdown to like how long it's going to be until like the next presidential debate or whatever, have a running count of like how many people are in ICE detention or whatever. And the call them camps, call them concentration camps bit of my call worked. The programming advice did not, but I think that it could be as effective, and I think it's important to break these places open and see what's inside, because it is very hard. As what Rogers and Hammerstein via Lin-Manuel Miranda said, you have to be carefully taught, right? This is true, but it is very hard for people to really hurt other people if they can see them as people. And I think that in some ways, by putting a face on these situations, maybe we can do something.
I think to the camps and carceral state question, I specifically had a section in my introduction of all the things that are related phenomenon, but I can't even get to all the camps, so I can't talk about these Syrian camps. But carceral state is one of them. The difference in theory, between prisons and concentration camps is that in theory, even if you have a corrupt, bad system, you have a trial. You have an individual trial. You may have a bad defense. You may be treated wrongly. You may not. Things can go wrong with it, but in theory, you have the trial. But what we have in the U.S. is we see things like Khalif Browder. We see whole neighborhoods in which the percentage of, let's say, African-American males, significant percentage of a given neighborhood will end up in jail. And then at some point, we've tipped over from any individual fate or individual action or any actual crime being committed, or even real suspicion of a crime being committed, that would put somebody in a prison to start with. And that's the whole premise of an individual fate in a prison system. So at some point, the distinction between the mass detention of civilians without trial and what we have in some of these detention and holding facilities that are part of the prison and jail system become almost indistinguishable. And so I don't want to pretend like there's a hard and bright line. And unfortunately, it's a real failing of the U.S. that we have so much turned to the carceral state and to longer and more vicious sentencing and sometimes racially preferential sentencing for different offenses. We create some mini camp-like systems even within our legal system. This is something you see in a lot of concentration camp systems around the world, that once they're there for a while, you have bleed over, and people from jails will sometimes be brought into camps, and sometimes often in a camp system, there's a jail inside the camp, so you become unable to make the distinction. So I don't want to pretend that there's a real distinction. I think the U.S., we have more options for ending them than many places, but we have a hugely carceral state that will make it harder to end what we're doing in other ways.
I think for us in this side of the world, it makes a lot of sense, right? Like how there was a massacre when they first came, and then slavery, and then we are seeing targeted incarceration. I'm using that word very much intentionally because it's not just mass incarceration, it's targeted to a certain group of people. And I agree that we need to put a human face to this issue, but we also have to recognize that this system is a requisite to continue this capitalist model. And so how do we move to really change that narrative and not just tell us your sad story, but also acknowledge how this country and the oligarchy specifically benefits from that oppression?
And just finally, to your point, I mean, it makes me think of the very compelling reminder around the time of the family separation. It's still happening at the time, I should say, that it was on everybody's lips and minds. Just the simple reminder that America has had a family separation policy in place for generations, and it is called the prison system. So being able to connect these dots and to not have this kind of political or moral tunnel vision seems like a crucial intervention. Since we started a bit late, we are technically out of time, but since we started late, I think we can end late. So is there another question?
We have to mention that another system was slavery, just that.
Yes, that was another family separation. Yes.
Well, thank you all so much for your contributions and also for the other audience members' questions. I really appreciate the sort of critical negative analysis in terms of understanding what we have, why it's wrong. But I'm also really interested in questions of like positive possibility beyond trying to break down the camp system, beyond trying to break down the prison system, beyond trying to break down the system of electronic ankle monitors. It's like a incredibly like behind closed doors privatized system of incarceration. What are like dreams, hopes, aspirations, both like the immediate, the pragmatic, as well as, you know, abolishing ICE, abolishing borders, abolishing capitalism, that we could maybe reflect on?
So Migrant Roots Media create platforms, uplift voices, open spaces, use white privilege and use class privilege to open these spaces for people who have been historically oppressed. I think that's, it is important to also think about what can you do. In our case, we've been trying to create those spaces to do a lot of skill sharing workshops, even because a lot of people who haven't had access for a long time have not been able to be in these spaces to learn some of the skills that you feel like they're very normal because maybe they didn't have access to buy certain things. And so how are we sharing those skills with people? So instead of speaking for them and taking the mics yourselves, how are you opening spaces for those people directly affected to speak? And that's why I'm so thankful that I was invited today.
That's why we're thankful that you said yes.
I mean, one of the things that I'm thinking of when there's something that feels very American about the possibilities question. I mean, I'm thinking of, and Greg Grandin writes about in the End of the Myth, his new book about the frontier. He actually, I think for Greg Grandin, perhaps it actually often came across as sort of a more optimistic take on the frontier myth than maybe I expected from somebody whose work has been as critical as his. And you know, a part of it is that these, you know, a lot of these changes are fairly recent, right? You know, the idea of a militarized border on the southern border, right? Because like the northern border still is like, you know, I mean, it is actually hardening, but it is still much more fluid, right? Than the southern border. You know, in El Paso, where I was briefly, and it sounds like you could talk about this. Yeah. So I mean, I mean, you feel like you're in a divided egg, right? I mean, it's the whole is a binational space that has this imposed artificial thing through it, right? And so one of the good, so while it is a negative, while it is a negation to try to take the bad thing out, right? It is also upholding something that is true and bigger than that was already there, and that requires that requires remembering the way that things were. It requires both in terms of ways in which there were things in the past that were better than now, and also the ways that the crimes of the past continue to pay dividends in our lives, and stopping, like there doesn't need to be a border wall. That's a stupid thing. It still isn't there, right? Because it's dumb, and like there are good human futures that are possible in these spaces, and a lot of them are either trying to get out or are kind of already there, right? I mean, like every day in El Paso, you go to the bridges between the U.S. side and the Mexico side, and it's people going to work back and forth. It's just getting rid of the bad stuff and letting the good stuff shine through, and then you can start trying to build a better future.
I have a weird answer to that question, which is that after looking at all these camp systems and after thinking my book might actually make a difference, for instance, for the Rohingya, but instead in between when I turned the book in and when it came out, Donald Trump got elected and Orban and Poland and all these other things happened. I've sort of come to a place where you certainly imagine all the different possible futures. You look realistically at what people can do. And Latin American poets from the 70s and 80s talked about this. But I proceed without hope. And I don't mean, that's not hopelessness. But you pick what your role is, you pick what you're going to do for it, and you do it because that's what you're doing. And you certainly have goals, and for the people that are active, I mean, I'm more on the journalistic side, but for people who are totally buried in activism, you have to have goals. As a journalist, you also have to have goals. But I'm not in charge of the outcome, so I think like recognizing that you make the difference that you think you can make, you focus on the things that you can focus on, and ultimately, like it's a collective thing. It will be up to the world what happens. And again, that's not surrendering power or saying I'm helpless. It's the opposite of that. It's like I'm choosing what I'm going to do, I'm choosing what I'm going to build, and to not link it, because you just get burned out if you think, I'm going to free those 100,000 Rohingyas still in detention in Myanmar, it's going to make a difference, and nothing happens. So if you just say, people need to know about this, people need to know this history, I'm going to go around and I'm going to tell you all about this history. When I visited Neuengamme in northern Germany, which was the first camp I visited, I talked with the archivist there, and he's been doing important work for 40 years. And I asked him, do you think by doing this, and telling people what happened here, that you will keep it from happening again? And he said, no. And I was shocked at the time. It was really shocking to me. He said, but if nobody even remembers and nobody even knows what happened, they won't even have a choice to do it or not to do it. He said, and it's my job to do that. And so I think you find the thing, and sometimes that's in consultation with other people. They help you figure it out, or you work together on something, or if you're a loner, you can maybe do something. Find your role, find your goal, and sometimes also just imagine a world beyond the things that we have, and exactly what you said. What would that world look like for the groups that you're part of, the communities you're part of, and for you yourself? Try to live inside that world. One of the things that I hate is how much we all talk about Donald Trump all the time now. Even on Twitter, people will make jokes about what he said that morning, even when they're saying mean things about him. It's just like, it takes the whole oxygen out of everything. So I think sometimes, and this is not to dismiss that so many people in our communities have to fight every day for even the smallest bits of humanity, but find something that is beyond this moment and this bad thing and create that world too. Like, do both. Stop the bad things that are happening now, but as you said, make the world that you want to live in, whatever that means in a constructive sense. But I proceed without hope.
Many worlds within this world, the Zapatistas.
If you could join me in thanking our panelists. And thank you for joining us too. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing those last points. They really.
Oh, thank you.
I always talk about the role, because when I was younger, I used to think that I could just collaborate with so many groups and do so many things, and I was like, oh, this is too much.
Well, it's a balance, because you can't just retreat into your shell and do nothing, but it's like you have to pick what we're doing. And exactly. And you have to breathe. Oh, thank you for coming out. Thanks very much.
Good to see you. Yes. Oh, thank you. Yes.
I worried it was too bleak for people, you know?
Thank you for bringing that microphones to people. Hey, how are you? Good to see you. Appreciate that.